Hello everyone, and welcome to this first session of our 3 half days webinar on the voluntary sustainability claims on seafood products. We are pleased to welcome you despite the technical challenges posed by the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. To quote the terms of reference of this workshop, the purpose of this workshop is to bring together the members of the PECH, institutions and external experts in a constructive exchange about how voluntary sustainability claims and information on seafood products, including ecolabels and certification schemes, interact with the European seafood market. As you will have seen on the agenda, there will be many interventions and very diverse. The aim has been to try to cover as many facets of the concept of sustainability and its definition on the field. We will talk about private and public initiatives, experiences from the whole value chain, the real economic and environmental aspects and impacts, the consumer reaction, animal welfare, and finally, some examples of well-known labels. So the sustainability, this is a very precise concept which can be defined as a way of meeting our present needs without compromising the capacities of future generations to meet their own. So it's a simple definition in principle, but which becomes very more complex when it needs to be defined deeper. We generally divide sustainability into 3 dimensions: the environmental, economic, and the social dimension. Each dimension is then subdivided into several factors. I like to say that there are as many definitions of sustainability as there are people to define it. And I'm sure you will figure out that fact during these 3 days sessions. I also like to compare the definition of sustainability to a DJ mixing table. The sound that comes out depends on the importance given to each input. It's exactly the same for sustainability. Depending on the importance given to each factor and to each dimension, the definition will give more importance to the economy or the environment or the social aspect. And it is this definition which, depending on its orientation, will best resonate in the ear of the consumer and which, in the context of labels, will make the consumer more aware to one or to the other, as we will see it by Wednesday. If you have any question to the panelists, please use the question and answer chat button and specify the name of the panelist you want to reach. He or she will answer you at the end of the panel. Regarding the busy schedule, I ask the speakers to respect the time dedicated to them and not to exceed. As a moderator, I will specifically take care of this, and this will also allow you to ask questions to the panelists at the end of each panel. Finally, I would like to thank, on behalf of the PECH, the European Commission for letting us organize this workshop, and to thank all of you for being present today. This shows to what extent sustainability is a key issue to the Europe of tomorrow. I also thank warmly our General Secretary, Pedro Rey Santos, for the organization of this workshop and his great work. I also thank and give the floor directly to our first speaker, the member of the European Parliament, Pierre Karleskind, Chair of the European Parliament PECH Committee. Sir, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, merci pour votre intervention. Merci pour l'organisation de cette réunion. Vous l'avez dit, il s'agit aussi maintenant de réunir différents acteurs suite à la crise du Covid-19, un peu partout dans tous les secteurs qui nous concernent sur les questions de pêche, d'aquaculture, de produits de la pêche, de transformation. On voit bien que les uns et les autres ont eu une crise à gérer. Et il convient peut-être de reprendre le cours des choses tout en ayant à l'esprit, puisque c'est une revendication de beaucoup de nos concitoyens, que l'après-Covid-19 soit un peu différent de l'avant-Covid-19. Il s'agit évidemment de se replacer dans des discussions, en tout cas celles que vous allez avoir aujourd'hui, qui font fortement écho à un ensemble de l'actualité européenne. Je pense évidemment au pacte vert, au Green Deal, comme il est appelé en anglais. Le pacte vert qui, justement, parle tant de durabilité, de faire en sorte que notre fonctionnement ici en Europe ne compromette pas les capacités des générations à venir à disposer d'une nature nourricière, d'écosystèmes qui leur fournissent des services, puis tout simplement d'un environnement qui est sain. La durabilité est évidemment au centre des différentes politiques que nous devons mener et des enjeux qui sont les nôtres devant. Alors, vous comparez la durabilité à une platine de DJ. Moi, je comparerais la durabilité à une recette de cuisine, puisque nous parlons aujourd'hui de produits pour nous nourrir, d'une recette de cuisine dans laquelle eh bien, il faut ne pas surdoser un des ingrédients, parce que si vous surdosez un des ingrédients, eh bien, vous gâchez l'ensemble de la recette. Et c'est bien là l'enjeu qui est le nôtre aujourd'hui, être capable de pouvoir mettre sur la table et prendre en considération des enjeux qui, si on les oublie ou si on les met en trop forte dose, vont évidemment rendre difficile la réalisation des autres enjeux. Et c'est là toute la difficulté de cette durabilité. Parmi les autres actualités politiques que nous avons, il y a la stratégie de la ferme à la table, la Farm to Fork Strategy en anglais, qui est évidemment un élément essentiel, surtout pour ce qui nous concerne, et surtout pour faire en sorte, parce que je crois que c'est absolument crucial, que nous puissions bien valoriser et mettre en avant la spécificité de nos productions européennes. Sur le pacte vert, nous avons eu l'occasion d'avoir des échanges au sein de la commission pêche que je préside. Il s'agit de faire en sorte que le pacte vert englobe effectivement les océans, les mers, la pêche et l'aquaculture, mais aussi qu'on n'oublie pas dans cette recette subtile qu'il nous faut trouver l'enjeu alimentaire, parce que les pêcheurs et les aquaculteurs, les transformateurs des produits de la mer, eh bien, nous fournissent à manger et on ne peut pas sacrifier cet enjeu sur l'autel d'autres enjeux. La stratégie de la ferme à la table. Nous avons eu l'occasion de recevoir le commissaire Zinckevicius. Non, je me trompe, c'était la stratégie biodiversité. Nous avons eu l'occasion d'avoir un échange avec les services de la commission à propos de cette stratégie de la ferme à la table. Nous avons dit, je dois le dire pour ceux qui n'ont pas eu l'occasion d'assister à cette réunion de commission, que nous avons fait part de notre déception sur la faiblesse de la prise en compte des aspects produits de la mer dans cette stratégie. Sur un aspect absolument essentiel, la traçabilité. D'ailleurs, traçabilité qui est prise en compte dans le règlement contrôle. Donc sur l'aspect traçabilité, il s'agit bien d'une part, de protéger le consommateur, le protéger contre le fait de ne pas être au courant de ce qu'il mange. Les consommateurs doivent pouvoir savoir ce qu'ils mangent. Pour lutter contre la pêche illégale, la pêche INN, IUU en anglais, eh bien, cet aspect de traçabilité est absolument important. Mais, je viens de le dire, la traçabilité doit être aussi un élément essentiel de la valorisation des produits européens de la pêche et de l'aquaculture. Nous sommes dans un marché qui importe très majoritairement les produits qu'il consomme. Eh bien, je crois, parce que nous avons des critères et des standards de durabilité, justement, environnementale, sanitaire, sociale, eh bien, il est important que le consommateur puisse savoir quand il achète un produit européen. Évidemment, ces produits devront, et vous en êtes convaincus, et vous allez regarder comment on peut s'en servir, comment on peut s'en sortir, devront pouvoir être repérables par les consommateurs. Alors, on parle évidemment de l'étiquetage approprié, mais alors, comment étiqueter, comment aller vers cette possibilité pour les consommateurs de repérer le savoir-faire des industries européennes de la transformation. Plusieurs solutions sont devant nous. Un étiquetage de type public avec un écolabel public européen. A priori, la politique commune des pêches européenne garantit déjà que tous les produits de la pêche et de l'aquaculture sont durables partout. Nous sommes en 2020, l'année à laquelle, normalement, tous les stocks devraient être gérés au rendement maximum durable au niveau européen. Donc, nous avons déjà les standards les plus élevés au monde. Donc, sachons être capables de le montrer. Il nous faut évidemment, parce que j'ai dit nous sommes en 2020, nous devrions être au rendement maximum durable pour les espèces de poissons. Ce n'est pas le cas partout. C'est pas le cas partout. Le contrôle, nous sommes encore en train d'adopter un règlement. Ça veut dire qu'il y a peut-être quelques trous dans la raquette dans les contrôles. Et puis, il n'est pas évident aujourd'hui, et je regardais encore des documentaires à la télévision française, il n'est pas évident encore pour nos concitoyens que la pêche européenne est la plus durable du monde. Et donc, il va falloir nous expliquer, il va falloir expliquer que c'est le cas, il va falloir faire beaucoup de travail de pédagogie encore et il va falloir atteindre un certain nombre d'objectifs pour cela. En tout cas, moi je crois qu'il y a une possibilité d'un label public européen avec une valeur ajoutée. Sur les écosystèmes, sur les écolabels privés, moi je crois qu'il y a de la place, évidemment, ils peuvent être nécessaires pour pointer les problèmes existants, évidemment. Ils sont intéressants parce qu'ils permettent aussi d'aller plus loin que la norme, de mettre en valeur des initiatives, des spécificités qui seront tout à fait intéressantes et importantes à valoriser, avec évidemment une difficulté qu'il faut avoir en tête, mais qui est aussi valable pour un écolabel européen. Parce qu'il faut à un moment, quand on a un écolabel, et bien ça demande de l'argent, quelle accessibilité pour les producteurs, et puis à un moment, pour le consommateur, trop d'informations tue l'information, pourrait-on dire en français. Alors, nous attendons que la Commission européenne travaille là-dessus, nous attendons que vous, et ça va être un élément important de votre travail aujourd'hui, que vous travaillez dessus et que vous puissiez nous donner des orientations. Je crois que le pacte vert et la stratégie de la ferme à la table. Moi, je préfère la ferme à la fourchette. Alors, la traduction en anglais, je ne me rappelle plus quelle est-elle. Donc, de la ferme à la table doivent pas être vues comme des politiques sanctions, mais bien comme des politiques de valorisation. Je crois que c'est vraiment l'enjeu pour nous, Européens, de bien dire que les contraintes, ce qu'on appelle les contraintes environnementales, sociales, économiques, sanitaires, ce pas des contraintes, ce sont des atouts qu'il faut savoir valoriser. Je crois qu'il faut bien les prendre comme ça et qu'il faut que dans notre discours, nous les ayons comme ça. Et puis enfin, je crois que les écolabels, cette capacité à mieux valoriser notre façon de faire, devra passer et peut-être l'occasion de relancer, de renouer, de renforcer des liens entre le secteur de la pêche, de l'aquaculture, et le secteur de la transformation, évidemment, mais aussi les institutions européennes, que ce soit les services de la Commission, que ce soit les politiques au Parlement européen, et puis les scientifiques et les organisations non gouvernementales, les ONG, qui ont un rôle absolument essentiel. On le voit, elles sont des lanceurs d'alerte. On est souvent, parfois, quand on est dans le secteur de la pêche, en tout cas pour ceux qui sont dans le secteur de la pêche, parfois un peu gênés aux entournures, parfois par certaines actions, elles ont parfois ce rôle de lanceur d'alerte, mais aussi la plupart, beaucoup, ont un rôle de travail très clair. Et sur certains labels, c'est déjà le cas, sur certaines pêcheries, c'est déjà le cas, certains transformateurs travaillent déjà avec elles. Les ONG peuvent être des guides, peuvent aider à la réalisation de ces critères de durabilité et donner du sens, du coup, au travail qui est fait et donner de la confiance aux consommateurs dans la valorisation des produits. Voilà, je ne vais pas être plus long. Moi, je vous souhaite de bons travaux. Je reste sur ce début de matinée avec vous. Ce que je veux simplement dire, c'est que nous avons évidemment devant nous des enjeux extrêmement importants. N'oublions pas dans la durabilité qu'il y a aussi l'enjeu alimentaire. On l'oublie souvent un peu trop vite au profit des autres enjeux. Donc, vous avez fort à faire et nous comptons sur vous. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Very good speech. That summarize really good all the challenges of this workshop and all the challenges of the upcoming years in Europe. So we will continue this introduction with Professor Simon Bush, Professor and Chair of Environmental Policy at the Wageningen University. We talk about the terms and forms of sustainability claims. Sir, you have the floor.
Thanks, Benoit. Let me quickly share my screen here. Yes, can everyone see my slides there? Benoit, can you confirm that? Yep, okay. So thanks very much for this opportunity to talk to you today about seafood sustainability claims in this very interesting discussion that Pierre has now introduced, right, over whether or not and in what ways the European Union could adopt an eco-label perhaps, or at least the European Union moving into this space of making claims and governing seafood through markets. Of course, this is very timely, and I'm very excited about this discussion, given, of course, the move to a new Green Deal and, of course, the farm to fork strategy that sets the stage for this discussion. I clearly understand that. What I'd like to start by just observing, though, is, it's important, I think, to also understand that the very global position of the European Union when it comes to seafood, and also, of course, the very global nature of seafood trade in general. Maybe just two quick numbers to remind ourselves is that, 65%, right? What's that number? That's the number. That's the self-sufficiency rate of the European Union, meaning that 65% of the fish which enters into the European Union comes from other countries, right? It is imported. And also the importance of the European Union as a global market. It makes up 63% by value of global trade. So Europe plays an important role globally, not just in terms of the fish produced and sold in Europe. I think that's the position and discussion I would encourage everyone to have over the next couple of days. What I've been asked to do in a very short amount of time is to give an introduction to what sustainability claims are all about. And I think Benoit started with a very nice statement indeed. There's all sorts of flavors when it comes to sustainability. The DJ mixing table, I think, is a nice metaphor to start us off with. I like that. But what I've been asked to do is to take a few steps back and generally introduce what these market-based claims are. And of course, I'm going to raise some of the key points I think should be taken forward into your discussions in the next couple of days. It may seem obvious, but we need to put it out there, right? Market-based claims operate within markets, and that means it's not only focusing on producers. A lot of the discussion when it comes to standards, when it comes to market-based forms of governance, really focuses on what producers are doing, producer practices, because that's, after all, what the standards, whatever the standards might be, that's what they focus on, right? Producer practices, the production of fish stocks, and of course the performance of regulatory systems. But of course it's much more, and we often don't recognize that. At least we don't recognize that fast enough. Moving beyond producers, we have trade. And of course, Pierre just mentioned traceability, that becoming and already is, of course, a very important area related to, say, sustainability. I don't think traceability drives sustainability. It's not necessarily even designed for sustainability, but of course it helps to facilitate the ability to know more about where fish come from, to know more about the production practices, to know more about what the credence qualities of the fish are. That means everything that's not related to the product, things like sustainability, things that you can't see by holding the fish. And that's why we need these intermediaries, these standards, to communicate from producers through to consumers. And traceability becomes an important part of that, providing information. Product integrity, also related to sustainability, and also starts to raise, I think we're becoming increasingly aware, issues around equity, not only within the European Union, but also globally. Well, how much are we paying for our fish? How much are fish producers, traders getting for the fish that they're selling? And at the right-hand side there, it's under my face, I see at the moment, but is fish consumption. And that's another very important part of this puzzle. Of course, we don't have a market without consumers. And again, when we talk about market-based claims and sustainability, we often leave out those consumers. Consumers are looking for various claims within the market. And we could argue that the proliferation of claims that I'm going to go into in a minute comes partly from consumer demand. Of course, it also comes from NGOs who are representing, let's say, a broad range of consumer and consumer interests. And what consumers need and what they want when they're going shopping is information, and what are the different modes and forms through which that information can be communicated, especially around, going back to the DJ table, these very abstract but very mixed claims that we see under this umbrella of sustainability. So we have to see this full system. And how can we summarize all of this? Well, what market-based claims are doing essentially is really operating at the interface also of these different points in this idealized chain. We have, as I've already mentioned, credence-related product information. So this is information which, again, you can't see from looking at the product itself. You need some intermediary, a label, and of course what stands behind the label, to communicate all of the information that goes on around production, trade, eventually, of course, communicating that to consumers. How do these claims work? Well, of course, price transmission plays a role, but I would say what plays a larger role is preferential market access. You're holding essentially, market access as a carrot, as an incentive for producers and traders to live up to certain predefined standards. And that's the mechanism essentially that really is behind these market-based claims and what holds leverage over change processes related to, say, to sustainability. Okay, so that's the certification sort of schemes 101 slide. Now what I want to do now is just quickly run through, I can't do justice to this in the space of 15 minutes, but the broad range of claims and schemes that are out there. We can have a whole another hour talking about the different claims. We could talk about equitability through things like fair trade, for example. We could talk about traceability. We've mentioned it already. Sustainability is that enormous box again. Pierre mentioned legality, right? When we're talking about IUU, when we're talking about illegal, unreported, unregulated fisheries. Is that part of sustainability? Absolutely. But it is indeed a claim a little bit unto itself. Responsible. Proactive, improvement, these are all different claims which we see being made on the market in various forms. If you look to the right-hand side of the slide there, you'll see claims, just a collection of claims which relate simply, and organisations I should say in addition to that, which relate simply and only to tuna. Perhaps one of the busier species in terms of claims made, but it just gives you an illustration of all the, and there's many more than this, all the different schemes and claims made within those schemes around that single set of species. Now, once we get past claims, we've also got to think about, well, what kind of assessments are out there? And this becomes really fundamental to understanding claims and the credibility of claims. Is it a first-party claim? Is it simply a fisherman putting it very simply saying, I'm sustainable, trust me, I've tested myself and I'm sustainable? Is it a first-party claim? Is it a matter of a supermarket saying, well, we've tested our buyers, or sorry, our suppliers, and our suppliers are sustainable? That's a second-party claim. Or is it a third-party claim, meaning that you'll have a buyer and a supplier, and you'll have an independent third party? Of course, the one that we all look to in fisheries, most dominantly at least, is the Marine Stewardship Council, and is an organisation which holds independent standards against which the performance of those producers, the practices of those producers is assessed. So a buyer can look to this third party to get credibility, to seek credibility over whether and to what extent sustainability performance is being enacted in the context of production. So there's a whole discussion there as well. Then there's who are the claims being made to? Now, what we've just talked about in the previous slide, consumer-facing claims, right? That's moving claims from a producer all the way through to a consumer. But of course, within the business world, there's all sorts of claims and forms of assessment that occur simply business to business. And within aquaculture, if we talk about fish in more broad terms, within aquaculture there, we can talk about labels like Global Gap, for example, where retailers are looking to get certification over their suppliers, but that isn't passed on. Well, it is sort of passed on now, but let's not make things too complicated. But in generally, that's just for the retailers to provide some level of assurance for themselves that their suppliers are meeting their demands in terms of sustainability. And of course, there's business to NGO as well, right? There's still situations where businesses want to demonstrate their good behavior, not necessarily to consumers only, but also to NGOs. So there's a range of different claims aimed at different groups in society. And behind all of this, again, this could be another hour or many hours of discussion. There are multiple methodologies for assessing this thing we call sustainability. And again, building on Benoit's opening comments there, why do we have all these methodologies? Because, absolutely because, sustainability is an imperfectly measurable credence attribute. What does that mean? It means, again, this credence attribute, meaning that this is a product attribute which cannot be seen by simply holding or tasting the product. It is an abstract thing, this sustainability, and we need abstract systems like labels to communicate that information. And we need multiple methodologies to be able to measure and determine specifically what flavor of sustainability, as Benoit put it, is really being delivered. So that's where we see this proliferation coming from. Okay, now next to that, because we have this whole proliferation, what we also see, and what we over the last, let's say, decade, are a range of organizations which are essentially, if you like, setting standards for standards. There's this ambition in some ways to provide oversight, I would say, rather than harmonization. So recognizing this proliferation and recognizing the need to provide a level of oversight over both the content of these standards, but also over how they were produced, these standards, right? Was it through a credible, legitimate process? This is also being discussed. And this oversight is being provided by NGOs, by commercial partnerships, let's say, with states and NGOs. I think the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, GSSI, is an example of that. We also see NGOs like Fish Source providing oversight of not only the certification standards, but also, and I'll get to this in a minute, this whole other box of improvements, fisheries improvements, and all the initiatives which go along with that. FIPS, I'm sure, is a word everyone's heard. Now they cover, as I said, process and content of standards, and there's a range of different approaches for doing this. And I think another discussion we might be having is, just like we see this proliferation of standards, are we risking also a new round of proliferation when it comes to these new oversight bodies? Perhaps also something which can be discussed in the context of what role the European Union can play. So the last slide before I get into some of what I see as the sort of key issues for discussion, just to illustrate again what we're talking about when we're talking about sustainability. Essentially, we're talking about improvement. We're talking about moving fishermen along a line of improvement from a situation where they're perhaps not performing sustainably, let alone legally, to a situation, if you move along this arc here, to something green, right? Something which is deemed to be sustainable, meets, let's say, the requirements of standards which lay out a certain claim for sustainability. Now, what situation are we in globally now? Well, we're in a situation where 12, depending on how you count which schemes, which certification and rating schemes you take, 12 to 21% is covered by a sustainability related claim. 12 to 21% of global production, that is fisheries production. That leaves, of course, and I'm not saying that's not an achievement, that's an achievement unto itself, right? But that still leaves a huge body of fisheries, a huge volume of fish, which is not covered by a sustainability related claim, and perhaps is arguably not even affected, or is affected to a very small degree by sustainability as a concept. Now, what's the goal here? Well, if you take this notion of improvement, you can see that indeed we have fisheries which fall into this green box. That means that they are deemed to be at least sustainable according to whatever claim that they're complying to, whether that be MSC or some other certification or ratings body. Now, I think it's also interesting to note here in the context of the European Union, 18 to 25% of European net supply is indeed covered by some sustainability claim. But I think, as I said at the start, it's also very important to note that the EU can't feed itself when it comes to seafood and relies very much on an international market. So the EU is still, whether we like it or not, going to be engaging with fisheries that come from all different parts of the world that are nowhere near, let's say, having a quarter of their fisheries as meeting some form of sustainability claim. That means, what does that mean? It means that the majority of fish which is entering into various markets around the world, including Europe, are in this bottom left-hand corner. That means they're not being assessed by a sustainability claim, and perhaps, but still again, the majority aren't, but perhaps they're engaged with some form of fishery improvement activity. Could be a fishery improvement project led by an NGO or a government even, but still there's probably only a small band of fisheries which are falling into this box as well. So what we're talking about is the broad challenge of moving sustainability or fisheries through to sustainability by meeting and complying to some sustainability claim. And that's the big challenge, because the majority of fisheries don't yet do that. Okay, so that's the general picture that I was asked to give. Now, what I want to draw our attention to, and I'll do this as quick as I can, is 3 dimensions that should be taken, I think, into consideration when we're talking about market-based claims. And what I call this is the devil's triangle, because it's really a puzzle of how you can balance these three corners of the triangle, and even ask ourselves, is it possible to balance these three corners of the triangle? At the top, credibility. The credibility of the claim, of course, is fundamental. And how is credibility related to accessibility? How accessible is that scheme, that certification or rating scheme? And whether and to what degree those schemes deliver continual improvement or just improvement. And how do we balance these three things? That's what I want to go into now. So very quickly, what makes a credible claim? I won't talk about this for very long, but just to run you through these 5 points. Scientific rigor often comes back. If we look across that, and let me say also that there's a variety of organizations out there which define credibility of labels. This is somewhat of a synthesis of those different approaches. We can talk about scientific rigor. We can talk about impartiality and independence. That brings us back to this first, second, and third party set of claims. You know, do we really see a claim which is made by a fisherman or by a buyer, perhaps only buying from one fishery, as being very credible? Are they independent? That's a question. So that builds into this notion of credibility. Public insight, so let's say insight by relevant stakeholders, perhaps even the public, and into the review, the content, let's say, and the procedures associated with a particular claim. That becomes important for credibility. The reproducibility of an impact, reflecting the claims made. So is there impact? Do standards have an impact? Of course, that's going to affect credibility as well. And accessibility, as I've said already, to both standards and markets by producers and consumers. Can producers access a label, or is it simply too hard, too difficult? What effect does that have on credibility? Likewise, can producers who are certified access the kinds of markets that they were hoping to access or not? That's also going to affect credibility. Okay, let me move on. Why does accessibility matter, right? That's that bottom left-hand corner of the triangle. Why does accessibility matter? Well, this figure, I think, illustrates that point. You know, the volume of fisheries that are certified or rated, differ considerably by region around the world. Now, this donut on the left-hand side there takes into consideration certification. That's the blue there. It also takes in the rating schemes, which is the green, yellow, red stoplight kind of rating schemes. And if we see there, we get around about 20–22%, which is covered by those schemes. But of course, if we look around the world, we see very different outcomes, right? In Europe, again, that 25%, roughly a little bit more than 25%, in fact, which is covered by these schemes is apparent there. If we go to Asia, on the right-hand side there, a very big donut, because that's where the majority of fish globally is produced, but a very small proportion is actually covered by these rating schemes. The US, the United States, let's say North America, very strong coverage there. Africa, Latin America, very limited coverage, right? So if we're in a global market, if we want to understand Europe's influence over sustainable seafood, this kind of figure matters. And making sure that we're not creating a system, any kind of system which is exclusive, is important, because if it's an exclusive system, then you're simply not going to take on board a global sustainability of seafood. We're going to create standards which are accessible for those that can comply with them. And you've got to ask yourself, that might be a very low risk, low reward strategy. And do we want that? Or do we want to go for more of a high risk, high reward strategy and really move global sustainability forward in the seafood sector? Why does accessibility matter at number 2? Well, it also matters because, even though that previous slide is indicating there are differences geographically around the world in terms of the volumes of fish produced, and also, of course, the volume of fish which is subscribed or is complying to a sustainability claim, we see broader trends towards, as we see on the left, on the right-hand side there, I should say, we see convergence in terms of the imports of developing and developed countries. It is not going to be the same in the future as it was in the past. It's not going to be a north-south divide where developing countries are going to simply import all of the fish from developed countries, importing the fish from developing countries, I should say. What we're seeing, even though those developed markets are much more valuable, as we see on the left-hand side there, the graph on the left-hand side, in terms of, when we're talking about millions of tons, in terms of weight, we're still seeing convergence there. So we have to not only understand what the European Union can do in terms of a market, right, in terms of attracting fish, buying fish and selling fish on this market, but also understanding what norms, what standards, what approaches to sustainability can be placed in different markets around the world if we want to be able to move global seafood towards, indeed, sustainability. Now, the third corner of that triangle I put up, right? Improvement. Why does improvement matter? Well, the easy way of saying it is, well, if we're doing all of this, all these standards, we have all these claims, but it's really not going to move anyone or any fisherman or any fish stock to a sustainable practice or a sustainable level, then why are we doing it? That's the easy way of saying it. I want to use this slide to also illustrate the dangers, right? And also to help us think about why certain fisheries can perhaps make certain claims of sustainability, but risk not actually making improvements in the water. This is some work we did a few years ago on fishery improvement projects. And what we found, based on a 5-step methodology of FIPS, you can see that in the graph there, moving from step 1 to step 5. Right, we see that after step 2, market access is given to fish which are registered in a fishery improvement project. But improvements aren't expected to occur in this methodology until step 4. Now, what does that mean? It means that a number of fisheries in FIPS, if you can see my cursor here, were piling up, let's say, in step 3. That means that they had market access, but they were not moving through to a situation where they were actually making improvements. Now, we could look at this graph and think, well, that is the fault of the fishermen. They've registered in a FIP and they've decided not to move through to improvement. So they're tricking us. But there's another way of thinking about it. What markets were allowing that fish to be sold on a long-term ongoing basis, and which markets were not holding market access as a condition for improvement to allow this situation to occur? So what I'm saying here is that the failure to improve is not only in the hands of the fishermen, it's also in the hands of the market to ensure that that conditionality is there. If we want to use the market for sustainability, conditionality has to be in place. And we've seen that that's not always the case. Okay, so let me wrap up, guys, because I'm sure I've taken more time than was allocated. The question we're left with, I think, is how do we balance the triangle? How can we come with claims that are credible, accessible, and also drive towards improvement? I think there are 3 questions we can ask. I'm not going to give you answers as such, I'm just going to give you the questions. So what level of accessibility, we need to ask ourselves, is acceptable at what cost to credibility? In other words, do we go for a highly rigorous, credible standard in terms of high standards, which means that only few fishermen can access it? Or do we go for a very accessible claim, accessible set of standards, which perhaps is lower in terms of scientific rigor? Of course, both ends of that spectrum is not what we want. We want something in the middle, right? But what is that middle is the big question. If we go to another dimension, right, between credibility and improvement, what level of credibility is needed to ensure what level of improvement, right? Do we go for huge improvements in one go, and that's the only means of improvement? Or do we try to take fishermen in more incremental steps along a path of improvement? What kinds of standards do we need in able to cover the broad range of fishermen that are out there? Some fishermen can make huge investments in sustainability overnight. A lot of other fishermen, the vast majority, are unable to do that. And they need different mechanisms, different standards to support this movement towards sustainability. Another conundrum. And the last question, once I move everyone's faces off it, is what level of accessibility matches which level of improvement, right? That was that last slide that I put up. How much accessibility do we need? How much inclusion of how many fishermen do we need in order to ensure global sustainability of seafood? We can talk about regional sustainability, we can talk about local sustainability. I'm very much of the mind that we need to take a global perspective when it comes to seafood. Not all fish move, but a large number of them do. And so we need to understand this as a transboundary global problem. And this question, I think, becomes fundamental. So this raises two key propositions that I would encourage you to take forward in your discussions today and tomorrow. Perhaps not in line with what the EU wants, but I would argue that no single unified sustainability claim will ever satisfy producers, traders, and consumers. No single claim. I think there's always going to be a number of claims out there, a number of methodologies out there that's going to reflect, that has to reflect the huge diversity and complexity of global seafood. If we want to move seafood through to a sustainable state, there's no single standard which can do that. There's no single methodology which can do that. Proposition 2, a diverse system of codes and standards is the only way to reach global sustainability outcomes. Of course, that follows on from what I've just said. So that, I think, raises, and this is the last two slides, it raises a really key set of questions, right? If we're in a world where we have multiple claims from multiple standards, if we see that that is the situation that's going to remain, and we see that exists for multiple reasons, including the fact that there's multiple and diverse incentives which are needed at different points in global value chains, then the key issue is not to harmonize or come with a single standard, I would argue. I think the challenge is instead is to ensure that there are not coordination failures between all of the different claims and standards and codes that are out there. That means that we're not creating extra costs through the value chain. We're not creating extra work for fishermen, creating a burden for fishermen, and we're not overly confusing consumers. Recognizing consumers can deal with a level of selection and choice, mind you. So we have to avoid high costs throughout the chain, and we have to, and I think this is key, ensure that we avoid unconditional market claims. That means that sustainability claims are made without providing an adequate level of conditionality for improvement in the market. And I think that leads to, this is my final slide, I think that leads to a question around what role is there for organizations moving forward? Is it just a matter of building the next standard and a better standard to outdo the other standards? I don't think so. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. A way of thinking about it, I think, is to overcome these coordination failures, which I think are apparent within the seafood sector, in fact, apparent in any food sector currently when it comes to sustainability codes and standards. Here we have to think about what kind of organization can provide a coordination of oversight, right, of conditionality for multiple codes and standards. And I think we have to move to tailor-made sustainability claims for buyers also, right? So what combination of these different codes and standards would buyers be willing to adopt in their portfolio of products that match their risk acceptance, right? If a buyer wants to have a low risk, meaning they only want to have sustainable products in their shelves, that's going to be a low risk, low reward strategy. They'll have their sustainable products, but are they contributing to global sustainability? We need to give, and I would say that's probably the norm at the moment. I think what we need to move instead towards is a high risk, high reward strategy. We need to provide buyers who are willing to take high risk products onto their shelves, meaning that products that aren't going to be sustainable tomorrow, but need to move towards sustainability over the longer term, need to be given both recognition and a pathway within the market to be able to make those improvements. So high risk, but ultimately high reward, because that's the kind of strategy that's going to move global seafood towards better performance, not just the best performance. So I think that's really the point I want to leave you with. What kind of organizations could play a role like that in this broader picture of sustainable seafood? I could keep going, as I'm sure you can hear, but I'm going to stop there and hand back to Benoit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really, really interesting. So yes, indeed, you exceed a little bit the time, but it's important for the introduction. That's why I didn't stop you. I see we have one question from Stephen Adolf to you, Mr. Bush. If you have any other question to Mr. Pierre Karleskind or to Mr. Bush, do not hesitate to write it now, and then we will move to the next panel. But yes, Professor, if you want to answer.
Oh, where did I find the question? My mistake. Yeah, Benoit, can you read the question to me? I can't find it.
Oh, sure. Next to the concerns of the credibility of sustainability claims on the environmental content, could you contemplate a little more on the instrumental use of such claims by industry stakeholders as a way to block competition and place market barriers for competitors from outside the EU markets?
Yeah, I can see that, that Stephen is raising a big issue there. I'm not going to give you the entire answer. I think that's something we should be discussing for the next 2 days, right? That, yeah, we have to be very aware, and I think that's the point he's adding to the presentation I've just given, that these standards are used by different parties, of course, for their own interest. And that's also what I guess I'm pointing towards with this idea of unconditional market access, right? That we have, in some instances, there are indeed standards which are out there, which you can question the credibility in terms of their scientific rigor, perhaps. You can also, of course, question the ways in which organizations are using certain standards for their own commercial gain. I think it's important that, you know, we understand what conditionality standards hold over fishermen, but, and that comes back to my point, we also have to really understand what role that buyers in places like Europe also play in setting or not setting conditionality for improvement in a global market, right? If it's not in the interest of a buyer to be very strong when it comes to conditionality because they simply need the fish on their shelves, then we've got to recognize that. And we've also got to recognize the consequences of that for pushing sustainability forward. There's a lot in Stephen's question, I think, but that's what I want to raise in the discussion for today.
All right, we have a second question to you, Professor. Thanks for interesting presentation, many challenges. My question, is more progress being made in all this concerning sustainability and labeling in the aquaculture sector as opposed to capture fisheries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've certainly lent my presentation today towards capture fisheries, but of course all of this holds for aquaculture as well. Aquaculture, I think, is in some ways even more interesting than capture fisheries because we have a larger range of standards, codes and standards out there for aquaculture, in fact, than we do for capture fisheries. So one could argue within the fishery improvement space, there's a lot more going on than in aquaculture. That's true, I think. But when it comes to standards, there's a lot more standards relevant for aquaculture, given that aquaculture is at the border of, let's say, agriculture, right, and fish production than there is for fisheries. So that raises a whole bunch of other questions, and in fact makes let's say, the consequences of having standards that aren't living up to, let's say, scientific rigor and competition between standards even more, let's say, difficult to deal with than it is in capture fisheries. So generally, yes, these patterns are the same across both, but there are also differences.
Okay, thank you very much. So we really need to move ahead with this workshop. So thank you very much to Pierre, Karleskind, and to you,
Thank you.
Professor. So yeah. We will move to the next speaker, which is Nianjun Shen, Senior Fishery Officer from FAO, for the guidelines for eco-labeling for fish and fishery products.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me here. My name is Nianjun Shen. I'm the Senior Fishery Officer responsible for market access issues like certification, traceability, and catch documentation schemes, and now also looking after the value chain work in the department. Today I'm going to give you a brief introduction about what we are doing as our part of normative work on certification. Basically, I'm going to touch on the certification for the marine capture fisheries and aquaculture. And I'm also going to introduce some of the technical assistance and the capacity building works we've already carried on. So first, the purpose. Let's try to move it ahead. Is to provide guidance to governments and organizations that are maintain or considering the establishment labor schemes for certifying fish from fisheries or from the aquaculture. So that's the purpose of the 3 guidelines we're talking about. And those are the 3 guidelines. I'm going to put everything here. We have basically 3 voluntary guidelines. The voluntary guidelines for marine capture fisheries, which was adopted back in 2005 and revised in 2009. And the second one was on the inland fisheries, for the inland capture fisheries. And the very latest one was on the aquaculture, which was adopted back in 2011. And to have something on top of that, we also have one evaluation framework for aquaculture certification, which was approved in 2013. That evaluation framework is basically a kind of a documented criteria, so different types of indicators in an effort to harmonize different schemes booming at that time. And I just want to mention that all those 3 guidelines are basically the reference documents, which my colleague may refer later on about the work on the GSSI. This part is about general principles. So basically, we have 14 principles listed in the marine capture fishery guidelines. And you can imagine that, first of all, I've grouped them into different categories. So you can imagine that all those guidelines mention that the basic principle of the schemes, they should be consistent with relevant international laws, which include UNCLOS, the Fish Stock Agreement, and any laws introduced by WTO. And of course, all the schemes should be voluntary based and should be transparent and non-discriminative. Basically, we also have to consider the special conditions and the requirements applied to developing states. Here is the components of the voluntary guidelines for marine capture fisheries. I just wanted to touch basically the procedures and the institutional aspects and minimum substantive requirement and criteria. The minimum substantive requirements of the criteria consists of 4 categories. Management systems. The requirement in that category means the fisheries should be conducted on the management scheme which is based upon good practice and to ensure the satisfaction of the requirements of and the criteria described in the guidelines. Stock under consideration. Stock under consideration means this stock is not to be overfished and is maintained at a level which will promote the objective of optimal utilization and maintain its availability of present and future generations. Ecosystem consideration requires that adverse impacts of the fisheries on the ecosystem should be appropriately assessed and effectively addressed. Procedures and the institutional aspects consist of 3 guidelines, meaning setting of standards, accreditation, and certification. And each of those 3 parts is further divided into 4 sections: purposes, normative references, functions and structures, and requirements. So basically those conditions are, those elements are quite clearly stated in the voluntary guidelines. This is basically the structure of the technical guidelines for aquaculture certification. And more or less they have the similar structure, except this part of, on the minimum substantive criteria in aquaculture, we introduce animal health and welfare, food safety and quality. Those are the parts which were not covered by the marine capture fisheries. Environment integrity is more or less corresponding to the marine capture fishery part, capture certification part regarding the environmental sustainability and social responsibilities. At that time, it was mentioned already in the aquaculture certification. I will slightly just touch on the work on the GSSI, because GSSI, which our colleague Hugo will introduce later on about the benchmark tools and what they are doing. I just want to mention that basically the GSSI benchmark tools are based on the 3 guidelines, evaluation framework, as well as the FAO code of conduct for responsible fisheries. I'm not going to details because Hugo is going to mention that later on. Some work of FAO on technical assistance work and the capacity building work on certification. We are very much focused on developing countries, and all the capacity building activities is combined with the exchange of experiences. We promote experiences sharing among countries in the same region or across regions. We mainly involve government officials and the business operators, academics and NGOs, etc., but based on geographic balance. We also produce some technical documents and studies and present success cases. We provide support to the consultation to our member countries on the development of their national ecolabel certification schemes. And we are also in harmonization of the standards. We collect different types of recommendations from different activities and the support to our members as reference. Some example about what we are doing. I'm going to present 2 examples here. One is the workshop on national ecolabel for marine capture fisheries back in 2015 in Thailand. And at that time, it was a workshop to discuss about the feasibility to have ecolabel certification scheme for marine capture fisheries for Thailand. We also had an international workshop on Chinese seafood sustainability standard for responsible fisheries last year in China. And this is very similar to Thailand workshop. We have more than 50 participants coming to this workshop representing a wide range of countries, including government representatives and researchers and aquaculture farmers, feed producers, NGOs, civil society organizations. And basically it was recognized that the setup and adoption of the Chinese sustainable standard will have very positive impact on the sector and will positively contribute to the change of the way of doing business and to improve consumers' confidence. But we also recognize that this is the beginning of the journey to develop such a system. So it is proposed to have a second one to invite more stakeholders to deliberate on the issues. And this should include the retailers and the consumer organizations as well. 2 examples about what we produce for as a result of studies on the certification. And the first one is on the seafood certification in developing countries with a focus on Asia back in 2018. And this report reviewed the existing schemes and its effectiveness on the fisheries and the fisheries management market access in those developing countries. And the second one is a very latest one, is under the FAO umbrella program working for the small scale fisheries. So basically in this document, both documents can be downloaded online. I look at the fishery improvement projects in the context of the small scale fisheries value chains, and it consists of FIPS. strengths and the weakness as a mechanism to operationalize the recommendations laid out in the Chapter 7 of the voluntary guidelines, which you may easily find when you try to download it from the FAO website. And those are very typical research studies we introduce. So that's the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to send to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will just move to the next one, to Bjørn Erik Lund, Senior Advisor to the Nordic Swan Ecolabeling. We talk about the Nordic Swan Ecolabel. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have agreed that the slides will be run by Pedro, the 9 slides that I have produced. So we will get the slides up, I guess. Yes, here they are coming. I thank you for inviting the Nordic Swan to this to present the initiative from a public initiative to ecolabel, as we have in Europe the oldest ecolabel of our type 1 in the ISO vocabulary for environmental labels. Is the oldest one is the Blue Angel in Germany, founded already in 1978, and the biggest one with the largest market target is naturally the EU ecolabel, which was established in 1992, I guess. Both these are sister organizations, and in practice doing the work the same way that we do in the Nordic Swan ecolabel. We are a multinational public initiative, and then made it to a market success on product groups. Unfortunately, not about fish or fisheries, but I come back to that in my presentation. The type of ecolabel is as mentioned, ISO type 1 with multiple criteria, life cycle approach for finding those multiple criteria, and a third-party verification and certification. We cover the 5 Nordic countries, and this is in area a big part of Europe, but as you might know, the market is not bigger than less than 30 million people living in these countries. We were founded by the Nordic Council of Ministers in 1989, and the special thing with the Nordic Swan compared to our colleagues is that it was the Ministers of Consumer Affairs that reflected on the very different private claims and labels on the market at that time, presenting not so truthful information to the consumer. So they wanted to establish a public ecolabel, or made a decision about a public ecolabel common for the 5 countries. The work is done now is administered nationally by on consignment from the governments in national organizations, and these national organizations are excuse me, anything from private entities to, we started in standard organizations in 3 of the 5 countries. Now it's only in Denmark where it's connected. There's a department for eco-labeling at the standards organization. The others are different in construction. We have some more than 2,000 companies that carry the label on products meaning both goods and services. And we cover 62, we have criteria or standards for 62 product categories, covering perhaps 200, 300 different product types. For instance, I mean, we have for furniture, and that covers everything for office, private, and wooden, and glass, and metal, and so on. We are 164 people working on the eco-labeling, where the same organizations are also the competent bodies for the EU eco-label in their respective countries. But that work is perhaps not so large in volume compared to the work with the Nordic Swan, and most of the work is done as verifying and certification work on the applications. But there's also naturally people working on marketing and general information to consumers and the market. The income we started naturally, it was a public financing from the very first years back in the 30 years ago. But now the public finance is less than 15% if you look at the total. Most of our income is, the major incomes is for the fixed application fees and then the license fees. The license fees are based on the turnover value of the eco-label product out from the licensee. Next slide. This is in more detail about how we have organized this, and we have still the principle. Nordic Council of Ministers adopted a regulation, which is from time to another revised. And then we have a Nordic Eco-Labeling Association, which is the board of managers. Having the board of the association is the management from the national organizations. The Nordic Eco-Labeling Board is constituted by the chairs of the national eco-labeling boards, and they have the responsibility of at the end adopt the standards, the text in the standards, in the criteria, and do the strategic considerations. This is made on a Nordic level. All the rest of the practical work is then done by these national organizations, and there's a built-in by this construction a full mutual recognition of the certification work done by the different organizations. Next slide. The success of a label is naturally in the marketplace is the awareness and the preference for a label to bring the correct message from the producer to the consumer or the professional buyer, the public purchasers among them, is the credibility of the label, and on a basis, naturally, the recognition among the consumers, the whole population. So we have reached a very respectable, we are proud of the figures that we find, and the credibility of the label is very high. We have the brand credibility study made in Finland shows that the Nordic Swan in Finland is among the top 10 credible brands on the marketplace. The top ones being the old Finnish chocolate producers, but the credibility of the label is also very high, and these figures are the numbers for the total in the Nordic countries. We have a small variation from country to country, but it's not in the range or out of the range of standard deviation of the figures from these kind of public surveys. And we do naturally have to work with this information flow in the marketplace, but then the strongest supporters are naturally the licensees that are using the labels in media, like in their marketing of Swan labeled products, being on television or so on. Those we see that these kind of campaigns from the licensees bring up the awareness and acknowledgement of the label very much. And compared to other kind of eco-labels or sustainability labels or in the marketplace, we the only one who is competing in figures with ours are the organic label for food, especially in Denmark and also in Sweden, where they both have very strong market positions, like the Nordic Swan on non-food. Next. The work we do is and I'm in a way referring also to having the credibility assurance from a label system, and that is that we are revising our standards, our criteria on regular basis. We do a review of the criteria at least every third year, and then revise the criteria normally, naturally. That is the cases that we are strengthening the requirements, and for at least the applicants have to apply again against the new criteria. The license is only based on the prevailing version of the criteria at the moment of application. And the basis for the 62 criteria is that we have to make a very clear definition of the product group. There's some language issues I see on the text, but we define a very clear product group, what products can be eco-label based on this standard or criteria set, and also often mention which cannot be, what kind of products cannot be included in the eco-label. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we have this life cycle perspective and find the most hotspots where the licensee can actually affect the issue, the environmental impact issue covered. There are issues also that are not that easily covered and by the licensee. And for instance, with when you are choosing what kind of electricity you are using, the national grid is not changed only directly by a single user or our licensees. That is something that the government is using stronger instruments and to regulate, and but we try to, or we have to find environmental issues to be covered, and naturally where we are in product groups where the social conditions or the ethics or production are very important, we include that also. We have requirements for in the criteria for toys, for cleaning services, on the working conditions, on laundry services, on some chemicals that are most from a health issues for the working conditions. And then naturally, when it was the consumer ministers who started this, we have a requirement on the function and the quality. One thing that is naturally also a very important environmental feature for any product, to have a good quality of a product and the possibility of longevity of the product. Next slide, please. So this is just to show the big picture that we cover a lot of different issues. We started with tissue paper and textile detergents back in 1990, and other consumer products then also included office equipment products, and went more and more included business-to-business products, and by that also going into services. Services like hotels, printing houses, cleaning services, laundry services. All these, we have a lot of producers that have chosen to fulfill our stringent criteria. Then we also have we have introduced this one label for private houses, starting with smaller private houses. Now we have big development projects with several hundred of consumers buying their first homes, and also public schools and public kindergarten are built with the Swan ecolabel. And then a very special new work has been on equity funds. That is something that our Austrian colleagues also have been into, financial instruments, and by that, in a way, we are covering everything from, and shown also that the ecolabel structure can be used for many different type of products. And then the question is, what next? And now I come to the story of on the next slide. I have in short the story of the connection also of Nordic Swan eco-labeling with fisheries and food in general. We have in the regulations from the Nordic Council of Ministers, there's no limitations of defined of what kind of products we can cover. The EU directive on the EU ecolabel excludes food and beverage and medicines, and actually we have been from it was in the Parliament when the Nordic Council had its session in Oslo some 15 years ago, and I see that it's about the same time when in 2005 the FAO first guidelines were adopted. These were the discussions where the Norwegian government and the Minister of Fisheries was looking for something, a solution. So he from the speaker's booth in the Nordic Parliament asked the Nordic Swan to take up fisheries. It ended up with a preliminary study by Ecolabel in Sweden. They were also contacted by the Fishermen's Organization in Sweden, and they made a preliminary study. That conclusion was that, well, yes, it could be possible. Many of our others in the organization, including me, were not that happy of thinking of doing that job, so there was no further action. We have made attempt from the Nordic Swan ecolabel to go into food, because naturally we see that for a consumer the sustainability or sustainable consumption, one of the most important products that we every day buy is the food. And we made criteria or standard for bakeries and bread. But that was not a political success, so to say. It was mostly, it was stopped on a very high political level, it was in the government in Denmark discussed that now we had to stop the swan, as from what I've learned. And the reason was that the organic label had such a high position on among the consumers in Denmark, and also that was supported by naturally the organic organizations responsible for organic labeling in the other countries. So it was stopped back in 2013. And what we have left now in the Nordic Swan, we do have in grocery shops and restaurants mentioned requirements for foodstuff, including fish. It's mostly about the requirement is based on this organic label foodstuff, but for fish we have in shops we have it gives points. It's not a mandatory requirement. It is giving points that can be collected from different product assortment, and there we have defined or mentioned MSC and the Swedish organic Krav certified wild fish and shellfish. And then the standard says that approval of other certification schemes may be sought from the Nordic Ecolabeling as required. We have by that open for any credible other labeling systems, and that would naturally then be considered. Then for restaurants, we base the requirements on fish on we have listed some from the EUCN's lists of red listed fish species. We have a general requirement of that the origin of the fish, where it comes from, has to be mentioned on the menu. But then also we have listed some fishes excluded. Well, the most popular one, I guess, among is the eel, and this is the basis now. And the last slide, with the last slide and picture, I only would like to mention that the starting point naturally for an ecolabel is the triple win-win-win situation where we have the correct information in the marketplace for the consumers to the buyers. The producers gain more market share, and in the end it's the environment that is the winner. And as a last point for the discussions further, I would like to, because I'm also involved in the One Planet work on the UNEP, on the consumer information program, and there we made guidelines for sustainable information to consumers, a paper that was published in 2018 and has a very good compilation of all kind of considerations to be made to fulfill the requirements, like the triangular slide of Professor Bush, which was very good to see and very good explaining the difficulties in reaching out with a good ecolabel, making a very difficult and multiple issue easily understood and seen by the consumer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So if you have any question, you can write it down in the Q&A chat box. So what I propose is to have a written answer, so we can move to the next panel in order to not to waste too much time. So I will ask to the panelists to answer in the chat box, please. So the next speakers is so we will move to the private initiatives. So the next one is Kathleen Pilling, Senior Manager Membership and Service in ICIL Alliance, and she will talk about he will talk about the codes of good practice of the International Social and Environmental Accreditation and Labeling Alliance. You have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting us to participate in today's workshop. I'll just start sharing my slides. I think I will avoid repeating as much as possible anything that Professor Bush covered. And I did want to share a little bit about the essentials of a credible and effective voluntary sustainability standard. The way that ICIL looks at this is that for a claim to be credible, the system behind that claim needs to be credible. So I'll try to give a brief overview of some of the resources that we have available that might help this dialogue. To start, just who is ICIL? We are a membership organization. We were founded in 2002. Our aim is to strengthen the effectiveness of voluntary sustainability standards. So we do provide a series of public technical resources for the development of credible sustainability standard systems. And amongst our membership and more broadly also in terms of a series of public resources, we are looking to support innovation for that really drives credible sustainability solutions at scale. So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to are the ICIL credibility principles. So these were first published in 2013 following a series of global stakeholder consultations. And these are principles that underpin credible and effective systems, and they do apply to a classic standards and certification system, but also more broadly. So as we look at new tools and approaches, these principles are intended to inform credible practice across a range of voluntary initiatives. And what I think the important thing here is to sort of highlight the fact that the principles are an accessible entry point. So a lot of our technical resources get into a lot of detail about specific practices, but the principles are intended to help a wide range of stakeholders, NGOs, government, business, as well as folks who are developing systems, to think about some of these high-level practices, principles that can underpin an effective system. Now, what do we mean by a system? A standard system is not just the setting of a voluntary standard, it's also thinking about how you intend to ensure that those standards criteria are being met. How do you intend to oversee those activities? So is that through an accreditation body, for instance? And how do you intend to trace that claim into the market, whether that's a consumer-facing claim or a B2B claim. And the, I think, important aspect of ICIL's recommendations are touched these components of the system, and then also the impact side. So again, this was highlighted by earlier speakers, but one of the sort of critical aspects of having a credible claim is also being able to monitor and evidence the impacts that you're having. So ISEAL has 3 codes of good practice, and we do have also a compliance program where our members are independently evaluated to these codes, but the codes are publicly available and support a lot of initiatives as they're looking to develop their systems. So we have a code that deals with standard setting, one that deals with impacts, and then also assurance, which is a term that we use to encompass different types of assessment. So I think the important thing here is, again, the impacts code. So there's 2 components to the impacts code. One is really starting an initiative with a strategic purpose. So I think this was mentioned both in the keynote and by Professor Bush. There's this important aspect of your strategy. So how are you adding value? How is your initiative adding value? Where are you going above minimum regulatory demands, and with what approach to improvement and scale? So the point of the impacts code is guidance on how you can set that strategy, and also monitor and measure the kind of improvement that you're delivering, and identifying where you need to improve your own system. So it supports continual improvement of both the content of your standard and your system. How effective is your system at transforming practice? And then quite importantly, in the context of claims, how are you substantiating the claims you're making about your impacts? The standard setting code deals very much with the processes behind how you've set your standard. So are you properly or adequately consulting stakeholders? So where stakeholders are going to be those affected parties, are you doing that in a way that's accessible? Are you balancing stakeholder interests in your process? The other aspect of the standard setting code that I think is important to note in light of the earlier discussions is the importance of being market relevant, having locally applicable standards, having considered questions of market access in the design of your standard. And then there's also the assurance code. So this allows you to develop a fit for purpose approach. So what kind of assessment methodology are you intending to have carried in your system? Are you ensuring that those assessments are consistent? Are you able to report accurately on the compliance levels that actors in your system are achieving? And are you learning from the assessment approaches? Are you learning from what your assessments have to say? So do you understand, for instance, where there's a high degree of non-compliance, and do you understand why that's happening, what kind of intervention you might need in your system? So the idea here is that it's not a static system that you've created, but one that has a number of important feedback and improvement loops that allows you to operate efficiently, credibly, and looking at the evidence of your impacts and adjusting your work in light of that. So this is a little bit the whole sort of suite of core technical resources that ISEAL provides. The other, I think, important set of resources to highlight in the context of this workshop, we also have some good practice guides. So one on how to approach benchmarking. And then we also have a series of good practice guides that relate to claims. So that helps you understand the interplay between the traceability model that you have and the claim that you might be making, the question of your strategy, and how that should inform the claim. So for instance, is your strategy targeting 3 aspects of sustainability, and are you making a sustainability claim? Are you more narrowly focused and making a claim of responsible practice? These are the kinds of questions that we look at here. The other, I think, important aspect of claims to highlight is that there's the claim is not in isolation. So the claim should link very clearly to the strategy that you have, the content of your standard, the nature of the assessment model. So for instance, if it is a second party claim, that you're not allowing people to think that that has independent third-party certification, so that you're clear and specific so that there are informed buyers, whether those are B2B or consumers, and that you're able to substantiate any claims that you're making about impact. So I think one of the important or key messages, I would say, from ICEAL's work and our learning is what is critical for an effective system is an investment in monitoring and evaluation and in-depth outcome and impact studies. This is the often sort of hidden work that will be happening with a more robust scheme, and this would be sort of a key thing to be looking at when you're considering different approaches. Has the monitoring and evaluation approach been really embedded inside of that system? Are they holding themselves accountable to learnings and continual improvement? And then just to highlight some of ICEAL's other work, which I mentioned in terms of innovations. So some of the areas that we're focused at the moment is improved data governance, so that there are better data sharing and better, again, this ability to take the data from your assurance system and learn effectively from that. Better assessment models. So by that we mean being more efficient in how assessment is designed, using multiple sources of information, better understanding how to respond to emerging risks, and then also looking at how improvement strategies fit in the whole ecosystem and how these can best drive change at scale. So these are a few of our other sort of broader areas of work that might be of interest. And then just to wrap up, when we talk about then complying with ICEAL's codes, this does really hinge, I think, on three key areas that are of particular relevance to this conversation. So we're talking about reliable claims in quite complex supply chains. Again, this question of reporting on impact and effectiveness, and then improving the standards model. So innovating and improving how you're doing your work in the field, or in the sea, I guess I should say. And we have a few further resources at our website. So the codes of good practice, the guidance materials, and we're actually in the process of consulting on updates and revisions to the credibility principles. And we would certainly invite you all to participate. That consultation is running until the 31st of July. And the materials, the consultation materials, are available in English and Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. So I will end there and see if that helps us catch up a little bit on time.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. So we will move directly to the last one of this panel. I think no, sorry, it's not the, it's not the last one. The second one of this panel of the private initiative. We'll give the floor to Hugo Burns, sorry if I misspell your name, Vice President for Product Integrity, to Harold Deleuze, and GSI Steering Board member. So he will present the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative. You have the floor.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to you all. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. If not, please let me know. And in fact, I realized that I wasn't at the very beginning of the presentation, which starts here. So indeed, it is my honor to present GSSI to you, the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative.
Sorry, we cannot see your screen at that time.
Okay, then I need to find out why that is, because I have pushed share screen. You still cannot see it?
Not yet. No. It's coming. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Well, that's the mystery of this kind of web, because I was clicking on the same button I was clicking before, but never mind. So let's start all over again. I'm here to present the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, which is all about confidence in seafood. And to be able to tell you that, I think I will give you a little bit of my background and what I do in my daily life, because I think that will help explain why my company was actually part of creating the GSSI. So I work for a global food retailer. We have stores in 3 different continents, but in no less than 8 of the European countries, 7 inside the EU. So that means that we source from the seafood that we sell in our stores from many different countries, many different sources. And therefore for us it's important that we know what kind of seafood we are selling, and what the sustainability level is of that seafood, because we have made a pledge that we are trying to sell 100% sustainable seafood. How do we measure that? Well, obviously by one of the certifications that have already been mentioned in previous presentations. But we've also realized that in certain markets, these kind of certifications simply do not exist for the wide range of products that we very much would like to sell in our stores. So to give you an example, I just saw in the ISEAL presentation that the picture on one of the guides is actually one of our certified sustainable seafood products that we sell. And in the Netherlands, indeed, we are able to sell almost 100% sustainable seafood. But in a country like Greece, this is more complex. We sell a lot of locally fished seafood there, but by far not everything is certified. So yes, we are looking at these improvement programs, the FIPS or the AIPs, with everything that comes with that, as already explained, how credible is an improvement project actually. So that is something we very much would like to look into and know more about. But even then, there will be seafood sold in our stores that is not certified or in an improvement program. And how then can we say something about that seafood, and how do we know what let's say the level of sustainability is? And all these things we try to cover in our work in GSSI, of which I'm a board member, and how GSSI can help us as a company to ensure that confidence. So GSSI is a global network of many, many companies, as you can see listed in the center of this particular slide. It works with all kinds of certification schemes that you can see on the bottom left corner, but we also work with many other partners, ranging from WWF, they are up next, very important, the FAO, but you can also see many other governmental, semi-governmental, private, non-profit organizations that are active in seafood. And as you can see from companies and these organizations, GSSI has been set up to be a global organization. So GSSI essentially has 3 different projects that are of interest for the presentation today. GSSI has a benchmark tool. GSSI is cooperating to develop a social benchmark tool. And we also have Seafood Map, which I would very much love to explain to you about as well. And I will actually explain all these three in my presentation right now. So this slide may look very familiar because Nianjun already also showed it, but it's essential for the benchmark tool that we have. Because yes, we do benchmark seafood schemes, or standards as they're more popularly called, against basically a set of requirements that's based on everything, on the work that FAO has done. And Nianjun has already explained that, so I won't go in that. But the slide does demonstrate that we don't take this lightly. The document that contains all the criteria is a very thick document if you were to print it. So better not do it, better refer to it online. But it does mean that any certification scheme gets benchmarked against all these criteria. And for us, that's essential because that then tells us which of these schemes are credible and credible for us, credible enough for us to use in our consumer communication, because that's important. Some will still argue that even if you meet all these criteria, you couldn't call it sustainable. You can certainly say that it meets the FAO criteria. But at least based on this, we develop, we make our claims on our products. So the benchmarking process is also an ongoing process. It's a process of continuous improvement. And based on the findings that we have, we revise our tool if necessary. And it's actually a process that we are going through right now. Because one of the things that we also do, even after we've recognized a particular scheme, we do have continuous monitoring to make sure that whatever the work that is done under that scheme continues to be aligned with our criteria. And here you can see an overview of the standards, the schemes that have passed the benchmark with success. Some of them are for fisheries, some of them are for aquaculture, some of them are very well known in Europe, some of them not so much because they serve different markets in different countries. And again, we are in 3 different continents for us, so for us it's important that we have these different schemes, but the common thing about all these schemes is that they do indeed pass the GSSI benchmark, have therefore GSSI recognition, providing those who use the system of GSSI the confidence that products based on certifications against these schemes can safely be sold by us in our stores. So that's the first part of my presentation, but I already said there are 2 other projects that we're working on in GSSI. So first of all, maybe good to explain that there is a kind of a global benchmarking landscape where the Consumer Goods Forum has GFSSI, which is for food safety, and it's a very commonly very well accepted benchmarking system for food safety management schemes. Won't go into that now. But the Consumer Goods Forum has also developed the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, SSCI. And that one is for environmental standards. A lot of it is still under development, but SSCI has now created criteria for social compliance benchmarking. And then, of course, GSSI is there for the environmental. But we have to remember that GSSI, the criteria that we have are environmental. So what we're trying to do now is that we're also going to look at how about the social compliance side of seafood, whether it's aquaculture, whether it's a processing, but we're also going to look into fisheries. And here are the criteria, the kind of points that we're looking at in these social compliance schemes. So you can read them for yourselves. The criteria have been set at the moment for processing. So standards can now be benchmarked against these criteria. That work has just started, and interestingly enough, the very first standard that was submitted for this benchmarking was the GAA standard for seafood, which comes from America. But hopefully more will join. What we're doing now is we're trying to see in how far we can apply the existing benchmark criteria also for aquaculture. And even more importantly, we are also looking in how that can be applied to fisheries. It's work ongoing, but it does mean that not only in the future we can look at and have assurance over the environmental side of seafood production, we can also look at the social side of affairs. I'm going through this very quickly, but I wasn't giving that much time, and I'm happy to answer any questions later, because there is also a third project at GSSI, and that is Seafood MAP. And MAP is the measuring and accelerating performance of global seafood supply. I was very interested to hear Professor Bush's comments on seafood certification only covers a certain percentage of the market, and there's so much out there that for whatever reason is not certified and may never get certified. And again, there are many reasons why that may happen. And the Seafood Map project that we are setting up, it's really under development. We're certainly not there yet. Is something that we are setting up to look at those fisheries, aquaculture that is not certified. What is actually the level of it? How do these fisheries and these aquaculture see themselves where they stand? How can they be improved? And this is indeed not to lose the connection with these fisheries, with this kind of aquaculture production, to see what the level is that they're at, and to hopefully then being able to engage with them to further improve. And that is really what the point is of Seafood Map, is to have globally an idea, where do all these fisheries stand? Where does this aquaculture stand? So in order for us to close the knowledge gap that we have on this kind of production, it's to inform, it's for the fisheries and aquaculture to inform us so that we can maybe inform our customers where we stand. It's also about trying to make commitments for improvement. And of course also it's about global collaboration so that we all speak the same language. Personally, I think this is very important that we do this, because we run the risk if we only look at top level production. And this is not only true for seafood, by the way, this is true for all commodities that we purchase globally. If we put the bar very high and only accept products that are at a very high level, we are running the risk of losing the connection with production in other countries that cannot meet that level. Because if we give people the message, you will never be able to reach the level of what we require, then they simply give up and they will not work on their continuous improvement to become more sustainable. So I adamantly believe that this is very important. So at the moment with the Seafood Map project, we're very much at the development and pilot phase, but we're hoping to roll it out to 21 and important to note that this is a cooperation with IDH. So this was in a nutshell an overview of the work that we do with GSSI. Yes, it's a private initiative, but we very closely cooperate with all kinds of governmental and semi-governmental institutions, and obviously I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really clear. Hugo, there is a question for you.
And it's actually a very good question. However, I'm not directly able to answer it. GSSI map is not in itself meant as a credibility and assurance tool. It's about information, and then about the interaction of the customers of the fishery or the fish farms. And maybe in the future we will be looking at how the information that is exchanged can be made more credible, but that is really for the future to see how we can do that. The first aim is to have an understanding of where these fisheries and farms, where they are in their sustainability journey, so that we can then engage with them. So the true assessment, the true assurance comes from the certification schemes.
Thank you. Any other question for the last panel? No. So I would like to thank every of our today's speaker. It was really, really interesting. What I can remember for today, that there is some room for European label on sustainability for the seafood products. That traceability is also a tool for sustainability, and also information is also a tool as traceability. For that sustainability. I can also remember that it's possible to have public labeling running on public fund, but not in 100% public funds. So something like less than 20% public funds. I can also remember that as Caitlin has said, the labels have to be credible. So we need to invest in that, in control, to make those labels credible and not only a piece of paper in a product. And as Hugo said, it needs to be more dialogue between the certification company, all the initiative, and the farmers and the fish farmers and the fisheries. So thank you very much. Thank you to the translators. Thank you to Pedro. Thank to all of you, and we will see you tomorrow for another session. Maybe a little bit more, as I could say, practical, maybe less theoretical and more practical on the experiences of the value chain from the fishing sector, the aquaculture sector, the processing sector, and for the retailers. And then we will talk about the benefits and impacts on environment and on markets. So thank you very much, and I see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock.